بسم الله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Do you have what the picture they took? Didn't you take one of the pictures at the beginning that was at the maqam? Remember when we were at the maqam? No, what they said at the beginning. Yeah. Did you take that? Yeah. Alhamdulillah. This is an ancient city that we're in, you know. The before the Muslims were here, it was Iconium, so it had a pre-Islamic history, but it was the capital of the Seljuk, one of the great dynasties of they were great servants of Islam, the Seljuk Empire. And this was their capital. But now it's honored, Now it's honored because it houses no, not that. It was at the Rumi's yesterday. It's a city that people from all over the world visit, and they go to visit the scholar and the saint and the poet Jalaluddin al-Rumi, who's actually Jalaluddin al-Balkhi. He's originally from Afghanistan. His father was from the Taim people, Bani Taim, which is one of the clans of Quraysh. So on his father's side, he's a Bakri, a Taimi from Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And then on his mother's side, his grandfather was a scholar, from a ruling family in Central Asia. So, we were at the maqam yesterday, and whenever they would teach the Mathnawi, they always began with a verse from the Mathnawi in the first lesson, which is, never think that the paths to God are difficult to pass. Never think that the paths to God are difficult to pass. To work with holiness is never difficult. And that's reiterated by Ibn Ata'illah, who says that if you think that Allah can't change you in one moment, then you know nothing about the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, we're here in the city, and it's a really beautiful city. It's noted for its piety in Turkey amongst the big cities. It has about 1.5 million people here, but they're noted for their piety. And somebody asked one of the people that's helping us here, who's from Kunya, what they do for their nightlife. He said, come in Ramadan and we'll show you our nightlife. Alhamdulillah. So that's a good answer. But Maulana he was a very notable scholar. He was not an insignificant scholar. He was actually known for his mastery of the sciences of Islam. And he was a exoteric scholar for a good part of the first part of his life. His father was a very well-known alim in Central Asia, and he was born in 1604, which is around 1207 by the Christian era. But his father got into a lot of trouble because he wouldn't be silent about a lot of the abuses and innovations of the rulers of Balkh and that area. And so he would go around preaching, and he actually had a lot of influence. He was very influential as a preacher and a scholar. And so he was basically persecuted, so that he left Balkh in 1607, and he went on a journey. His son at that point was about 3 years old. So they had to leave with their, and to make hijrah from a place of persecution to a freer place. What's interesting, though, is within a year, Balkh was completely destroyed by the Mongols. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, many of the scholars died, and it was a terrible time for the Muslims. But Allah wanted something else for that family, and obviously particularly for Jalaluddin al-Rumi. But they went to Damascus, they were in different places. He actually met Farid al-Attar when he was a very young boy, and Farid al-Attar gave him his famous book of poems, and he actually said that he's going to be a great poet. He told his father that he was going to be a great poet and a master of the path. And then when he came, they ended up in Konya, and he was trained here. And I think what a lot of people who are from the Arab world are maybe not as familiar with the scholastic tradition of this part of the world, but they were very serious students. They had a great madrasa system. There were several madrasas in this town, which were colleges, not schools. They were colleges, what we would call colleges today, religious colleges. But they were religious colleges where they studied many sciences. In the West, we have the concept of the trivium, which are the 3 language arts. In the Muslim world, there were about 30 language arts that they would master. So it was a much more advanced and sophisticated system. When you get into advanced Islamic tradition, by this period, 13th, 14th, 15th century, these people were studying texts on one of the sciences that they were very focused on was called ilm al-wada', which is a science that teaches you how to analyze the meanings of words in context. So it's a contextual analysis of words so that you can quickly ascertain what type of word is being used to remove ambiguity, because one of the most difficult problems with language is ambiguity. And they also had isti'ara was a very important science. So they have their own tradition. They would teach balagha, which has ma'ani, bayan, ma'ani wa badi'. And isti'ara is part of balagha, but because it's such an important part, which is the science of metaphors, because much of language, Ibn Jinni, one of the great grammarians and philologists in the Islamic tradition, argued that the vast majority of language is actually metaphor, that when you begin to analyze language, you will find that what you're dealing with is metaphors. We're using metaphors all of the time. So they would study that in order to better understand and comprehend language. He had a very popular madrasa here, college, Maulana Jalaluddin al-Rumi, and he had mastered all of these sciences at a very high level, and he was also extremely popular. And apparently from the stories, because there are some interesting biographies that were written very early that have people that knew him personally, but he was a very unusual boy as a child. And this is always, one wonders about these great minds, what they were like when they were children. The talk that Ken Robinson gave about the problems of education a few years back, and he just mentioned about, we tend not to think of Shakespeare as a child, but what was he like when he was in grammar school? And how would the English teacher really dealt with somebody like that? So I think the same is true. It's very interesting. There's some teachers their students actually surpassed them quite early on. Sa'duddin Taftazani is a good example of somebody who at a very early age had a massive opening, even though he was actually considered to be not very bright in the classroom, which is often the case with great geniuses, is that people think they're actually stupid. And he had a massive opening, and his teacher actually ended up putting him in the chair to start teaching the classes. So that does happen, but he obviously had an extraordinary experience by meeting a teacher who was completely what we would almost call an antinomian. He was a very unusual, wandering, itinerant preacher who had incredible impact and was usually chased out of places because he had such a massive impact. He was a charismatic. But when Jalaluddin fell under his spell, he really had a massive transformation, had incredible spiritual openings, and then from him poured forth all of this incredible poetry that's read all over the world. It's been translated into countless languages, and there's pilgrims that come from Japan, that come from England, Australia, all these different places to come visit this place. And I think you'll see we're going to go, inshallah, and visit the madrasa where it is. The cells are there. Their khalwa was 1,001 nights. They would do a khalwa. They had to do khidmah before they were actually allowed to study. So they had to go through a period of spiritual transformation. One of the stipulations was that they couldn't speak ill of anybody, or if they were treated badly, they could never retaliate. They would just have to accept everything that was done to them. And they had a very rigorous discipline. I think people forget how serious this early community was about their religion. And we tend to, as modern people, it's very difficult for us to imagine the intensity of practice and the intensity of dedication and devotion that these early peoples had in their religion. One of the Andalusian poets, he said, "Lana uswaratun fi bishri hindin wa ukhtiha wa qaysin wa laylatun min mayyin wa ghaylani." We have a good example in Bishru Hindin and in his sister, and Qays and Layla and Majnun, and in May and Ghaylan. These are famous love stories of the early Arabs. And what he was saying is that the reason God puts the Romeo and Juliets in the world is as a proof against anyone that claims to love God. That the intensity of erotic love, the intensity of love between two human beings can be so great that people actually go mad and they'll do anything for the beloved. And so those people are there in the world as a proof, according to that poet, against people who claim to love God. Like if you say you love Allah, قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهَ فَاتَّبِعُونِي. Say, if you love Allah, if you have a claim for something, الْبَيِّنَةُ عَلَى الْمُدَّعِي. The proof is on the one making the claim. So if you claim to love Allah, the proof is in following the Prophet ﷺ. That's the proof. So that's the proof of your love. And the Sahaba had complete tamahi. They were completely annihilated in the love of the Prophet ﷺ, to such a degree that Bilal, radiallahu anhu, after many years of being in Syria, came back to visit Medina. And some of the Madanis convinced him to give the adhan. It was very difficult for him, but he decided to. And when he gave the adhan, people heard the adhan for the first time from Bilal since the time of the Prophet, and they came out of their homes just weeping. They were just crying. That's how present the Prophet ﷺ was in their lives. Imam Malik, they said if the Prophet's name was mentioned, his face used to change. The color in his face would change. They had ishq, real love. And so he went through that intense period. And what he talks about is love. And mahabba, which is, I think you'll study with Sidi Hamza in the text on Ibn Ashir. In his, he talks about وَيَتَحَلَّ بِمَقَامَةِ الْيَقِينِ. And the last one is mahabba, the stations that you adorn yourself with. Because traditionally in that path you have what's called takhliya, and then you have tahliya, and then you have tajliya. And the takhliya is the emptying out. It's what in the Christian tradition they called it kenosis, where you empty out the self. Because the self is full of itself. You know, you talk about people, you know, you say he's full of himself. That's exactly what it means. He's full of himself. One of the things about darija, ammiya, a lot of people don't think what these terms mean, you know, in darija. But one of the things the Egyptians, they say, and they don't know what it means, but I'm convinced it's from their own spiritual tradition. If an Egyptian wants you to say, watch out, he says, خَلِّ بَالِكْ مِن نَفْسِكَ. You know, isn't that how they say watch out? خَلِّ بَالِكْ مِن نَفْسِكَ. But if you actually look at what it means in Arabic, it means empty your mind of your ego. خَلِّ بَالِكْ مِن نَفْسِكَ. Do the takhliya of yourself. That's how you watch out. Because the only thing that gets you in trouble is your nafs. That's the only thing. It's the only thing that gets you in trouble is your nafs. And so the Muslims were very serious about doing work on themselves. Now they're serious about doing work on everybody but themselves. They don't want to do any work on themselves because there's nothing wrong with them. It's America. That's what's wrong. It's Israel. That's what's wrong. It's Bashar. If we could just get rid of that guy, everything would be perfect. It's everything but where it all starts. That's why, and if you look at our condition, that's the whole basis of it. The Prophet ﷺ, he began by emptying them out. He made them vessels for the truth. But first he had to empty them out. Like the famous, you know, the martial artist who wanted to study with the master, and he goes and he meets this master that he's been trying to get the opportunity to study with them. And he says, oh, and I studied with Master so-and-so. We did this. I did Wing Chun, and then we studied with him, and I did this system, and then I studied with this, I did this. And he's telling the master all these people he studied with and all these things he learned. And so when the tea came, he just kept pouring the tea, the master, and until the cup was just overflowing. And this man says, well, why are the cup's full? He said, so? He said, no, you should stop filling it because it's full. So it can't take any more? He said, no, of course not. If it's full, it can't take any more. He said, well, you're full, so I can't. It's the same thing. You're full. And you find this motif in many teaching stories of Al-Hasan al-Shadhili when he went to meet Mullah Abdul Salam ibn Mashish. And here's a man who went from Morocco. He was a great scholar, studied in the Qarawiyyin, and then he went to Tunis. He studied. He went to the East, and he was looking for a spiritual master. When he got to Iraq, one of the people of Iraq told him, he said, the man you're looking for is in Morocco. So he went all the way from Morocco to Iraq, and the Iraqi man said, no, you're looking for Mullah Abdul Salam ibn Mashish. So he went back, and he went up the mountain. For anybody that's visited that part, it's near Tatwan. He went up the mountain to where this great sage was living. And when he first met him, he came in the clothes of the ulama. He had all these beautiful jalaba, and Mullah Abdul Salam ibn Mashish said, "Akhtasalt, did you do ghusl?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Irja." He said, "You didn't do." So he goes back. He does ghusl again. He comes back. He said, "Akhtasalt?" He said, "Yes." He said, "No, you didn't. Go back." So he goes back, And then on the third time, he got the point. He obviously doesn't mean what he. So he took the clothes of his servant and he put them on. He gave his servant his clothes. And then he came and he said, now you're ready to come. You have to strip away. And this is, people don't want to do this anymore. We're like, Jalaluddin al-Rumi tells a story about the barber. They used to do tattoos. So you go to the barber, you get your hair cut, you get a tattoo. Like now in America, right? And so he goes to the barber and he tells him, I want a tattoo. He said, well, what do you want? He said, I want a lion. People wonder why everybody's getting tattoos now. Tattoos are about the ego. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Now they say, I ink, therefore I am. That it's a way of letting people know I'm different. I'm special. I've got this butterfly on my back. You don't have one of those, right? And then they get more and more. And they can't stop because it's not working. You just keep trying to make it work. So he wants a lion because he wants to feel like a lion. So put a lion on my back. And so the tattoo artist, he says, all right. So he starts with his needling. What's that? He said, that's the tail. He said, no, make it a lion without a tail. So he said, okay. So then he starts again. What's that? He said, that's the ear. He said, no, make a lion without ears. He said, okay. And then he starts again. What's that? He said, that's the mane. No, make it a lion without a mane. And then he does it again. He says, what's that? It's the stomach. He said, no, I don't want a stomach on the lion. He said, listen, even God didn't make a lion like this. I can't do anything for you. And Rumi says that why he's telling the story is that this is people on the spiritual path. He says they want without any work. They don't want the pain of sacrifice, of work. They want the finished product just there for everybody to see, but they don't want to do any of the work to get there. So historically, Muslims, I think what we tend to forget about our religion is this religion is actually about getting close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the point of it. It's literally to get close to Allah. And not only to get close to Allah, but to experience the divine in our lives, to actually experience the presence of the divine. That we're in a world that has angelic beings, demonic beings, and we share this space. There's angels that come with believers, and there's shayateen that come with the people of foulness and misdeeds. So, drawing near to Allah, there are basically two paths, to getting close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of them is the path of salvation, which is for common people. That's the path of just the man who came to the Prophet and he said, Ya Rasulullah, if I pray 5 times a day, if I pay my zakat, if I fast Ramadan, if I make the Hajj, will I enter paradise? And the Prophet ﷺ said, yes. And there's a riwayah said, I avoid the haram. The Prophet said, you'll enter paradise. And then he said, then, wallahi, that's all I'm going to do. And he left. And the Prophet said, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الرَّجُلُ. And in a riwayah, he used the diminutive, the little man. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الرَّجُلُ إِن صَدَقَ. He'll have success if he's truthful. But that is the bare minimum. That's salvation. That's somebody who's getting close to Allah with the bare minimum. Those are the people that just do the bare minimum that they have to do to get the paycheck. There's jobs that you have, and if you just do the bare minimum, you'll get the paycheck. If you do less than that, they fire you. Right? But there's people, that's all they'll do, just the bare minimum. And then there's people that they want promotion. They want to get close to the boss. They want him to like them. They want this. This is the way the dunya works. And that's the path of purification, of tazkiyah and sanctification and getting close to Allah, of taqdees, of drawing near to Allah through extra acts. These are the nawafil. So you have the fara'id and then you have the nawafil. The more nawafil you do, the closer you get to Allah, but it's predicated on the fara'id. So if you're not doing the fara'id, then you're wasting your time doing the nawafil. And one of the signs, according to the people of that science, one of the signs of following hawa, of following your own desires, is that you prefer nawafil over fara'id. So there'll be people that will stay up all night and then they'll sleep through Fajr. Right? Really, there's people that do that. They'll like do dhikr late into the night, that they go to a mawlid or do something, and then they sleep through Fajr. These are people, that's talbisu iblis. And that's the way Iblis fools people and tricks people. So the path of both salvation and this other way, this higher way of really trying to draw near to Allah and through serving His ummah, serving His creation, sacrificing. Both of these are predicated on knowledge. The one that is the way of just the fara'id and doing the bare minimum, you have to have the bare minimum of knowledge, which is called fard ayn. The other way is the way you have to have the fard ayn, but then you also do the kifaya. You do extra. And our tradition, because of the sophistication and the problems that are attendant with revelation, a tradition emerged in the Islamic ethos. And the tradition emerged in order to protect revelation from misunderstanding. The early companions, Allah blessed those people with a level of knowledge and understanding that's unparalleled in our tradition, the first community. If you study the history, they were amazing, brilliant people. But if you look at the Sahaba, there are only a handful of Sahaba that gave fatwa. They're called the Mukthirun. There's only a handful of Sahaba that gave fatwa. People like Umar ibn al-Khattab, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Ibn Mas'ud, radiyallahu anhu. Abu Huraira is not from the Mukthirin of fatwa. Even though he had many hadith narrations, he didn't give a lot of fatwa. In fact, he gave a moderate amount, according to one riwayah. But one of the things about the early community is that they were loath to give fatwa. So if you went to ask one of the Sahaba a question, they used to say, go ask so-and-so. He knows better than me. And then they would go to him. Imam Nawawi writes this in his book on fatwa. And then they would say, go to so-and-so, go to so-and-so. And it would go until it came back to the original person. Now you have people that they jump to answer. And very quick to give an opinion. In Imam Malik's tradition, they call the fatwa nazila, which means musibah. And Imam Malik, if he was asked a question in fiqh, he used to say, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, which is what you say when you have a tribulation. Because basically, a fatwa is a response of a scholar who's trained, and in that response, he is saying, it is my belief that this is what God wants you to do in this situation. That's essentially what a fatwa is. You're saying, it's my belief that this is what God would want you to do in this situation. Now you get another person who can give a different fatwa. He'll say, it's my belief, this is what God wants you to say. And in many, many situations, you can have different views. Because one, God is vast, and two, understandings differ. So the Prophet ﷺ actually taught us that there can be two correct opinions. In Sahih al-Bukhari, the famous one that the Usuli scholars use is the one of praying Asr. The Prophet ﷺ told them not to pray Asr until they got to Bani Qurayza. And the group went, when Asr time came, half of them said it's time to pray, and the other half said no. The Prophet said don't pray until we get there. They said no, he didn't mean that. He meant get there before Asr. And the other group said no, he meant that we should pray when we get there. And we shouldn't pray Asr until we get there. So they split. So one group prayed Asr before they got there, and the second group waited. They delayed their prayer. When they got there, they told the Prophet what happened. He didn't say you're correct and you're wrong. He just left it at that. They were both correct. They both made an ijtihad. It was an ijtihadi situation, and that was it. Now you have people that believe there's only one way in Islam, and it just so happens to be their way. But we have this problem, that there's only one way in Islam, and it's my understanding. The reason that this happens, وَمَا اخْتَرَفُوا إِلَّا مِن بَعْدِ مَا جَاءَهُمُ الْعِلْمُ بَغْيًا بَيْنَهُم, that they didn't start differing until knowledge came to them, and they became arrogant with their knowledge. Fakhruddin al-Razi says about that, بَغْيًا بَيْنَهُم, he says, عَلَى بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ فَقَالَ الْحَقُّ مَعِيَ وَأَنْتَ لَسْتَ عَلَى شَيْءٍ. He said that it's one group saying, oh, I'm right and you're wrong. You don't have anything. So knowledge can be a source of conflict. And this is why Imam al-Ghazali in the first book, Kitab al-Ilm of the Ihya, he lays the foundations for a correct understanding of knowledge. What is knowledge? What is it? A lot of people don't know what knowledge is. They don't understand the nature of knowledge, that there are knowledges that are precise, and then there are imprecise knowledges. There are knowledges that have a lot of ambiguities in them. One of the, Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, he said that it's the mark of an educated mind to demand precision only to the degree with which that knowledge allows it. So in mathematics, you can get a very precise answer, but in other sciences, that answer might not be precise. It's just ambiguous by the very nature of the subject. And one of the greatest problems with language, and the reason why the modern world loves mathematics so much and is loath to really explore language in the ways that it did in the past, one of the reasons for that is the ambiguities of language. The modern world doesn't like ambiguities. And so people have lost the sciences that enable them to communicate with the least amount of ambiguity, because you have to exhaust language studies. And that's why the Muslims did this. And one of the sciences that this was predicated on was the science of what they called mantiq, and its sister science, which is called adab al-bahth wa al-munazara. In the West, these are called logic and dialectic. Logic and dialectic. And from these sciences, and there are ancillary sciences that go with this, like ilm al-wada' is one of them, balagha is another, because balagha is important. These became the foundation of Islamic studies in the Muslim world. Everywhere you went, they became the foundation. And all of our scholars write from this perspective. You cannot understand any of the major works of Islamic scholarship without understanding these foundational sciences that they were working with. And so what I thought I'd do tonight, just as an introduction, is read from the opening of a book which, to me, it's one of the most important books in our tradition, because it's the foundation of what's known as the science of tasawwuf. And increasingly, it's become clear to me that one of the great calamities of the modern Islamic situation is an idea somehow that tasawwuf is extraneous to Islam, that it's not part of Islam, that the reality of it is that it's a central core teaching of Islam, which does not mean that there are not a lot of problems inherent in tasawwuf. Just like there are problems that are inherent in fiqh, you have fuqaha that go astray. You have mutakallimun that go astray. You also have mutasawwifa that go astray. So they're just like any other group. And in fact, they're more susceptible because of the nature of their science to going astray. But one of the things that modern Muslims have done is that they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, to use an English idiom, in trying to purify our tradition from all of these innovations and all of these problems that came into it. They completely dismissed this science. And so this book was written by Sidi Ahmed Zarruq, the great North African scholar who was from Fez. He died in Misrata in Libya. But he wrote a book called Qawaid al-Tasawwuf, and in this book what he wanted to do, because he was an usuli scholar, and this is called ta'sil, which is to give the foundations of something. Ta'sil is very important in our tradition, because ala naqli, right, as-sihha wa ala al-mudda'i ad-dalil. Imam Athīr al-Iji, he says that the one transmitting something has to prove that it's sound, but the one claiming something has to give his dalil for it. So if you say qala ibn Mas'ud kaita wa kaita, you have to prove that Ibn Mas'ud really did say that. That's part of our tradition. So the naqil, the one transmitting, has to prove the soundness of his transmission. But the mudda'i, the one claiming something, who's just saying, here's the foundation of this, that, or the other, he has to give his dalil to show why. So if you have even istinbat, like where did you get that idea from? Well, I'm deriving it from the fact of this, this, and this. And then you make your argument. And these arguments are done through reasoning. And this is why reasoning is foundational to the human condition. One of the teachers in Turkey, he was a logician. They called him mantaqi, a logician. And he had a student, and he taught him logic. And when he finished all his classes, because logic it's not that difficult. It has abstractions that are sometimes a little complex to grasp. But basically, all of you are logicians. Everybody in here is a logician, unless you're mutakhallif, aqliyan, like somebody who's just handicapped intellectually. Or majnoon, which is possible also. Right? But if you are a sane human being, then you are always reasoning. You're either doing it well or you're doing it poorly, but you are definitely reasoning. The heart has reasons that the head has no knowledge of. But if you fall in love, you get married. People say love is irrational. It's definitely got some irrational components. But there's a reason why you get married. There's a reason why most people love for reasons. They fall in love with their beauty, their goodness. In fact, they say about the Prophet ﷺ that the reason why you learn the shama'il is because attraction to the beautiful qualities of a person is one of the reasons that love is cultivated. So just reading about him, he was very beautiful. He was physically a very beautiful person. He was the most beautiful of men. And everything was balanced with the Prophet. He had beautiful hair. He had very wavy black hair. It wasn't curly, it wasn't straight, because everything about him is balanced. So even his hair was balanced. It wasn't straight and it wasn't curly. The extremes, those are two extremes of hair. You have curly hair, you have straight hair. His was right in the middle of those two extremes. He had wavy hair, parted in the middle. It went sometimes to the bottom of the earlobe, sometimes to his shoulders. He had a very, very beautiful complexion. They said it was like the moon. And I asked one of my teachers, we were watching a harvest moon rise, and it was that beautiful color that's not white, it's off-white. It's like a wheat color. And I said, is that the color they meant? He said, that's the color they meant. It's not, because lam yakun amhaq. He was not pasty white, like the moon when it's right up on the sky. No, he had a reddish tint to his complexion. He had beautiful eyes. He had very, very white His whites, what they call, ophthalmologists in America call happy eyes. When very white. He had very, very white, the whites of his eyes were very white, and then he had very striking dark eyes that were penetrating. He had a beautiful aquiline nose, which is an aristocratic nose in many, many cultures. An aquiline nose is seen as a beautiful nose. And one of the reasons that's called aquiline is because it's aqna in Arabic, but in English they call it aquiline because it's like the aquila, the eagle. An eagle has a very beautiful. I once saw an eagle perched on a fence outside my house, and I just watched it for a little while, and I realized the eagle completely is aware that it's an eagle. If you observe an eagle, even for a short amount of time, you will see that an eagle is so aware that it is superior to every other bird. And the way it just looks around like, I am not afraid of anybody or anything. It's just got this amazing, and so the Arabs love eagles, and they name their children after them. And they're very, very noble birds, but they have these beautiful aquiline beak. And the Prophet ﷺ had a beautiful forehead. And he had he had broad shoulders, he was very strong, and he had a very small, light hair that went down. But he wasn't hairy at all. His body was very, his skin he did not have a lot of body hair, but he had very slight hair on his chest that went down to his navel. Very strong legs. He had strong hands. He walked in a very distinct way. Those are all qualities that if you study them, it actually makes you want to see him. I want to see that. I want to experience that. And then they describe how he spoke and the mellifluous nature of his speech. It was when people listened to him, they were enraptured. And when he spoke, it was like birds perched on their heads. It was as if there were birds perched on their heads. They were just so intent to hear what he had to say. But the reason that they describe that is because that's one of the reasons that you love a person, for physical beauty. And then you love them also for their character. And that's another reason. But the main reason that people love is because of ihsan, when people do good to you. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's the muhsin. I mean, He's constantly doing good to us, and that should engender love in you. And so love has reasons. There are reasons why we love. It's a rational thing as well. And so anyway, this Turkish logician taught this man logic, which is basically three things. It's understanding is the first operation of the mind, basic understanding, what they call a tasawwur sadij. It's a simple apprehension, just understanding something, what it is, glass of water. And then the second act of the mind is judgment, tasdeeq, or the proposition, making a statement, either negating or asserting something about something. So it needs a subject and a predicate, the mawdu' and the mahmul. And then the last operation of the mind is qiyas, or reasoning, going from what's known to what's unknown, min al-ma'lumi ila al-majhul. And so he taught him these things, and then he said, I want you to go into the marketplace, spend the day in the marketplace, and come back. So he went, spent the day in the market. He finished because he's going to give me ijaza in mantiq. Right? So he went to the marketplace, spent the day in the marketplace. He came back. He said, how was your day? I said, I did what you told me. I was in the marketplace all day. He said, did you notice anything? I said, no. He said, you're not ready, so we need to do this again. So they studied logic, second course. Did it all, understanding, judgment, reasoning. Finished his course. So he said to him, I want you to go and spend the day in the marketplace. Okay, so he goes, spends the day in the marketplace, comes back. He said, how was your day? In the marketplace all day, just like you told me, nothing. He said, we have to do this again. did the course in logic again, went through the 3 operations of the mind. When he finished it, he said, listen, I want you to go to the marketplace, spend the day in the marketplace, come back. He goes, spends the day in the marketplace, comes back. He said, how was your day? He said, oh my God, I couldn't believe it. They're all practicing logic. He said, now you're ready. He gave him his ijazah. Because that's what it is. The whole world is people reasoning, understanding basic things, asserting things or negating things, and then making arguments. That's what's going on. Everywhere you look, that's what's going on. Come in, there's a discount today. All right? There's a discount today. So, what's going on in the mind? Oh, if I buy today, I'm going to save money. Therefore, I should buy today, right? It's logic. The whole thing is predicated on reasoning. And that's what the student finally got, that it's happening all around you. And that's one of the really interesting things about studying logic, is that you begin to refine that process and are better able to understand what's being said to you and better able to communicate what you want to say to others. So I just want to show you, this is the book by Sidi Ahmed Zarruq called Qawaid al-Tasawwuf, and I'm going to read 2 qawaid and talk about them quickly, and then we're done. The first qaida, he says, al-kalamu fi shay far'u tasawwuri mahiyatihi وفائدته بشعور ذهني مكتسب أو بديهي ليرجع إليه في أفراد ما وقع عليه ردا وقبولا وتأصيلا وتفصيلا فلزم تقديم ذلك على الخوض فيه إعلاما به وتحضيدا عليه وإيماء لمادته فليفهم. So he says that kalam, before we can talk about a thing, in other words, before we can make judgments about things, we have to understand what the nature of that thing is. So, al-hukmu ala shay'in far'un an tasawwurihi. This is a qaida. Before you can make a judgment about a thing, you have to grasp what that thing is. So this is what he's saying. He's saying that al-kalamu fi shay far'u tasawwuri mahiyatihi. It is a branch of comprehending its essence, وَفَائِدَتِهِ, and comprehending what its benefit is, بِشُعُورٍ ذِهْنِيٍ. So this occurs in the mind, مُكْتَسِبٍ أو بديهيٍ. It either occurs discursively, through reflection, through being taught, or it's intuitive. You just grasp it immediately. So you have immediate knowledge, and then you have mediated knowledge. So immediate knowledge is 2 is greater than 1. Nobody needs to teach you that. A child will understand that. But that 2.5% in zakat is 1/40th, that's muktasib. That you have to understand, because you need to understand what fractions are, you need to understand what decimals are, and you need to understand the relationship between the 2. So that's a different type. So those are the 2 types. So he's saying that before we can speak about something, we have to grasp what its essence is and what its benefit is through this mentation, through this mental ratiocination would be a big word for it in the West. And then he says, in order لِيُرْجَعْ إِلَيْهِ فِي أَفْرَادِ مَا وَقَعَ عَلَيْهِ. These are all logical concepts. So this is called extension in logic. So the afrad, this is all those things that it extends to, because you have what's called comprehension and extension. All right? The comprehension is the tasawwur, or the understanding of it, what it is, and then the lima sadaq, and then the lima sadaq is what it applies to, right? What it applies to, all the things that it applies to. إعلاما به وتحضيدا عليه. So in order for it to be understood through it, and also the encouragement to know its fa'idah, to know its benefit, will encourage you to study it. وإيماء لمادته, and to to be able to articulate its subject matter. And so you should understand this. So here's the beginning of a book on tasawwuf, which is all based on mantiq. Like, you cannot understand this if you haven't studied mantiq. So this is our tradition. If you read tafsir, if you read aqidah, if you read any of the major sciences of Islam, especially usul al-fiqh, you will find that they're all relying on the reader's understanding of these mustalahat. And not just these, but several other sciences, especially when you get into the later scholastic tradition. By the time you get to somebody like Imam al-Bajuri, he's got balagha going, he's got mantiq going, he's got grammar going, he's got wada' going. It's mustalahat al-hadith, tafsir, usul al-fiqh, aqidah, falsafa, hikmah. All of these subjects he was well versed in, and this is how he's teaching. So then he says, "Mahiyatu shay haqiqatuhu." The essence of something is its reality. The essence of a thing is its reality. To understand the essence is to understand the reality, right? وَحَقِيقَتُهُ مَا دَلَّتْ عَلَيْهِ جُمْلَتُهُ. And its reality is what it's summarily means, what it means by summation, what it can be summed up into. وَالتَّعْرِيفُ ذَلِكَ بِحَدٍّ. And the definition of that is through a had, which is a term. In Latin, terminus means the end of something. So a term is the end of something. In Arabic, had is the end of something. Haddu shay tarafuhu wa akhiruhu. So the had is the end of something. And so this is وَهُوَ أَجْمَعُ. That is the most comprehensive, is a definition. But then you have what's called a rasm, which in Western logic is called a description. So something, and when we get into, I'm just giving you, this is just it's like at the restaurant when they give you a sample. So we're going to go into this in detail over the course of the next couple of weeks, inshallah. So don't worry about not getting any of this right now. When you get a had or a rasm, you need to know what are called the 5 predicables, which are the al-fadh al-khamsa. Right? So you have jins, the genus, you have the no', the species, you have the khasa, the differentia, and then you have the arad, which is like you have the proprium, which is and then you have the fasl, which is the differentia, the khasa, which is the proprium or the property, and then you have the arad. And some call those 2 types of accidents, the aradun lazimun and then aradun aridun. So those 5 things are going to enable you to give the had, the definition or the description. The had is the genus and the difference. So the genus is what you can say about a lot of things. The khasa is what's specific to that one thing. So with a human being, what's our definition traditionally in logic? What do they call the human being? What's that? Hayawanun natiqun, which in Arabic means the speaking animal, but they really mean the rational animal. In the West, we call it the rational animal. So our genus is rational. This is different from biology, because they talk about genus and species. So those are biological terms. This is logical terms. They're 2 different sciences. So don't get them confused. They're related, but they're used very specifically in these sciences for things that they mean in that science. So the genus is the general, and then the fasl is the difference. So with the human being, we're an animal, but many types of animals. So what makes us unique? What's the fasl? What differentiates us from other animals? Rationality. This is the definition. So this is a logical definition. Everything can be defined in this way, and this is the foundation of defining things. Because when we speak in language, when we want to know what usul al-fiqh is, right? What is usul al-fiqh? Very often it's in the thing itself. Usul al-fiqh. If you understand those 2 words, then you'll understand what the definition of usul al-fiqh is, and these are called ta'rifat, right? So this is how this works. And so he says, وَهُوَ أَوْضَحْ. The rasam, the description is clearer, أو tafsir, or it can explain something, وهو تم لبيانه وسرعة فهمه, and it helps you understand it quickly. وقد حد التصوف. See, now all of this was to introduce the definition of tasawwuf. All of this. So he's giving you, now he's told you, before we can talk about something, we have to define it. What's its definition? It's its reality. What is the reality of tasawwuf? وقد حد التصوف ورسم وفسر بوجوه. Tasawwuf has been defined, it's been described, and it's been explained in many, many different ways. تبلغ نحو الألفين. It will reach up to about 2,000 different definitions. مرجع كلها لصدق التوجه إلى الله تعالى. All of those definitions go back to one fundamental meaning: sincerity in your God-directedness. It's sincerity in your inner direction towards your Lord. That's the definition. وَإِنَّمَا هِيَ وُجُوهٌ فِيهِ وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ. So, what does that mean? What it means is, the genus of tasawwuf is ikhlas. That's the genus. It's sincerity. But the difference, because you can be sincere as a doctor, you're sincere, like you say, he's a very sincere doctor. Just means he doesn't cheat you, he's doing what should be done, right? So that's, the genus sincerity applies to many, many different things. He's a sincere student. He's a sincere son. We can apply that to him. But what is the difference? What's the fasl? It's sincerity in your directedness towards God, in those things that apply to your Lord. So you are sincere in your ibadah. You're sincere in your mu'amalat for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's tasawwuf. And that's why you can be a Sufi and be like, have nothing to do with that word. There's people in places that they might even not even like tasawwuf. They don't want to have anything to do with it. But they have sidq al-tawajjuh to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in that way, they have tasawwuf. So the name is just a name. What's the reality of the name? If you're stuck on the name, you're a nominalist. The name is just a name. Whether you call it tasawwuf or tazkiyah or ikhlas or tahara, taharatu nafs, right? Whatever you call it, it doesn't matter. Those are names. The Muslims for centuries called it tasawwuf. There's no reason to abandon that name, really. There's no reason. There's people that have tried to get rid of it, but there's no reason to abandon it once you clarify what it is. And the earliest Sufis, Imam al-Junayd said, no one can speak about this matter that hasn't mastered the book and the sunnah. That's what Imam Junayd said. Imam at-Tusturi said, I hear things about this matter, but I always go to two just witnesses to hear their testimony, the book and the sunnah. And this is why Sidi Ahmed Zarruq says, the Sufi has to submit to the faqih, and the faqih doesn't have to submit to the Sufi. If your tasawwuf is not in accord, and not some narrow-minded provincial faqih who only has one way of doing things. No, to the broad-based interpretive tradition of the fuqaha, which includes the methodology of the great imams of this ummah. So there's imams that say that you can do the mawlid, and that's the majority of the later scholastic tradition. There's imams that say, no, don't do that. That's fine. It's a khilaf issue. If you don't want to do it, that's fine. But if you do it, it has to be free of things that are munkarat. But to say it in and of itself is a munkar, no. Because غاية ما يقال فيه مكروه. غاية ما يقال. The worst that can be said about it is that it's makruh. according to the ulama. But to say that it's prohibited or something like that, I mean, that's an extreme position that very few scholars ever took. So anyway, that's my introduction. So inshallah, tomorrow I'm going to start with the 10 mabadi, which are foundational in our tradition, what are called the mabadi al-ashara إن مبادئ كل فن عشرة الحد والموضوع ثم الثمرة وفضله ونسبة والواضع والاسم الاستمداد وحكم الشارع مسائل وبعض بالبعض اكتفى ومن درى الجميع هذا الشرف. Imam al-Sabban, one of the great 18th century scholars, versified the 10 mabadi in that. It's in your book, and then I versified it for you in English if you want to memorize it in English. So those are the 10 mabadi. I'm going to do those tomorrow, inshallah. And that was the introduction to any Islamic science. Always began with this. It begins from an early period. They started doing this. And the reason for it was to give the student a comprehensive view of the subject before you went into it. It's like seeing the forest before the trees, which helps just to see the whole thing before you go in and say, okay, that's an oak, and that's an elm tree, and that's an acacia tree, and just to understand what a forest is. And so the subject is part of that, and the name and its sources, where it comes from. It's ranking. One of the things that we fail to do now in Western education, we don't rank knowledge anymore. So nobody knows what's more important. I mean, if you go to any college, most of you have been to college, some of you are in college, some of you are going to be going to college next year or something. If you go to college, they have these catalogs. They begin with astronomy and they end with zoology. It's just A to Z. There's no ranking. They don't tell you what you should take, what's important. This is more important than the other. Muslims always rank their sciences. It's called the fadluhu or rutbatuhu, sharafuhu. What's the virtue of the science? And the sharaf is muta'allaq bil mawdu'. It's the subject matter. So if the subject matter is God, it's a very high science. If the subject matter is dunya, it's a lower science. If the subject matter is language, it's a very high science because it's a tool to understand God. So these are the rankings, hierarchical nature of science, because we believe in maratib al-ulum. There are degrees of knowledge. Maratib al-wujud. There are degrees of existence. We have 4 levels of existence. You know, there's degrees in our tradition of existence. Then you have, metaphysically, you have other realms as well, the mulk, the malakut, the jabarut. So anyway, questions, answers, dumbfoundedness. Any questions? Alaikum salam.
Hamza, I've been teaching for about 10 years, and obviously before that I was a student, and I'm worried that modern education has deconstructed our reasoning skills. And if it has, in your opinion, do you think we'll need 13 years to reconstruct them also?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the modern world it's in a mess. I think all of us are pretty aware of that. And that's not to say that the pre-modern world wasn't either. In some ways, there's a lot of good, and in some ways, this is one of the better times that people have been living. So I'm not completely dismissive of the modern world, but there are things about the educational system in the past that were very problematic. But there are things with the modern system of education that are also very problematic. There are still places where you can get a reasonably good education, I would say. But in terms of those basic fundamental skills that are very important to grasp and should really be learned at a relatively early age, in the West, they were grammar and logic and rhetoric. and then also the skills of numbers. So these are the two types of literacy, what we call literacy with language, and then numeracy or literacy with numbers. And these are the two ways that human beings think. We think qualitatively, which is linguistically through language, and then we think quantitatively through number. So, and when we get into the categories, which are part of the tradition of logic, there are 10 categories. And after substance, the two categories that immediately follow that are quantity and quality, kam and kayf in Arabic. And so there was a book by a French philosopher at the turn of the century that was written, The Reign of Quantity, and a lot of people noticed this about the modern world, that it was a world of quantity, and quality was being taken out of the world. Not completely and not entirely, but quality is much less important to the people today than it ever has been. The idea of mastery is we have mastery in a few things. I think in music there's still a commitment to mastery. In certain sports there's a commitment to high levels of mastery. But the idea of mastering the mind, the idea of mastering the soul, the idea of mastering arts and crafts, becoming great craftsmen, becoming really masters of these things. It's very, very unusual in the modern world to meet people that are really committed to mastery of anything. And obviously the highest thing is to master yourself. And that is very difficult. Ahmed Zarruq said it's easier to move a mountain with your fingernails than it is to actually transform your nature. So but it is possible. And Imam al-Ghazali argued that anybody who claims that you cannot change nature is a liar. And he said, you can take a dog and train a dog. And he's saying, what, you can't take a human being that has rational nature and not transform it. You can take a dog that has, all over the place and teach it to do very relatively sophisticated tricks and teach it to sit. And what, you can't discipline the self? A dog you can discipline, but your own self, you can't teach it to stop. Don't do that. It's not good for you. This is incontinence, which is a beautiful word in the 19th century in America, and it was a moral term. It wasn't a medical term. And continence is the idea of restraint, self-restraint. Incontinence is acrasia, or the lack of self-restraint. Now it's been reduced to incontinent to stool and urine. This is what it's been reduced to. People that can't control their most basic bodily functions are called incontinent. But in reality, you should be able to control your nature. And this takes time, it takes practice, and it takes skill. But the modern world wants to strip that away. So certainly learning these skills are very important. In the modern world, logic has been reduced to what's called material logic, and we'll get into that in the third lecture. We'll get into material logic. You have formal logic and material logic. Material logic, one aspect of material logic is called the fallacies, which are called the safsata or the mughalatat. The mughalatat are fallacies of reasoning, so it's the content of your logic. And we're very susceptible to them. Politicians use them all the time. And we're very susceptible because the mind is susceptible to hasty generalizations. I'll give you an example. If you watched CNN before coming to Turkey, you probably would have canceled your trip, because they made it appear that this whole country was in revolution. And when you got here in Istanbul, you're there and it's very peaceful, and it's so ludicrous for people in New York. Don't go to Turkey, it's a dangerous place. They've gone crazy. Meanwhile, there's people getting mugged all over the place in Central Park, right? I mean, this is so much safer than being in New York. But, you know, people are afraid to come to Turkey because they watch the news. And the news is constantly using fallacies. And sometimes it's just pure deceit. But, you know, I mean, they said, for instance, how many people heard that they were going to tear down all the trees to build a mall? How many people heard that? Okay, look at that. That was a complete lie. They weren't going to tear down. They were actually going to remove some trees around the edge of the park to restore the fort that had been torn down. It was an Ottoman military base, and they were going to make a museum. They weren't building a mall, right? So it was this kind of, this massive, you know, this insane liberal capitalism gone mad. Turkey's on steroids. They're going to turn everything into malls. No, they were going to preserve the trees, make a museum, and the so-called mall was actually cafes around the area for people to enjoy the place. But it's a very, very secular part of Istanbul, and some of the people there, the majority of pubs in Istanbul are in that area, and because they put a 10 p.m. limit on sale of alcohol, which is the case in many states in America, right? They have these laws. I mean, you have many, many cities in the United States where you can't sell alcohol and then you have dry days. It wasn't that long ago before we had dry states, right? So this whole idea that, you know, no, you can't do that. If they see fit to, if they're having problems with disorderly conduct because of the sale of alcohol, then that's part of what public order is. You have to succumb to the public order. But if you looked at it, you know, these are tactics. People can't think clearly anymore. They showed a picture of 1.5 million people, and CNN said, this was a protest against the president. No, it was actually a protest for the president, a demonstration for the president, and then CNN retracted that a little later and said, whoops, we made a mistake. That was actually a pro-presidential. You know, so the people opposed to it were a few hundred people that they gave 9 hours of unprecedented live coverage on CNN International. I mean, where were they when Iceland was in rebellion against the parliament because the banks, they weren't going to pay the banks? Where were they? How many people got to see all the Greek rebellions and the abuse that the Greek protesters took from? I mean, you know, you need the tools of thinking in the modern world because you're up against a massive propaganda machine. And it's a propaganda machine that is not so much a conspiracy, but it's just they all think the same way. They look at things the same way. And so Turkey, because Turkey is a country that has a very, very troubling history for the West. Turkey was once the center of one of the most powerful dynasties in human history and had an empire that was unprecedented and lasted for a very long time. And there are people that there's a little bit of schizophrenia in the country. They were deeply traumatized. I mean, imagine in the United States or in Canada, imagine Obama announces, we have decided that starting tomorrow, all of English will be written in the Pinyin Chinese script because we realize that China is a rising power and we want to prepare our young people early so that they'll be able to read Chinese. So tomorrow, all the textbooks are going to be published in Chinese script. It's still English, don't worry. You're not going to be saying ni hou ma, you'll still say how are you, but it's going to be written like the Chinese write their script. I mean, imagine the trauma that would cause in a nation. And that's what was done here. They went from their Arabic Ottoman script to Latin-based script overnight. And then Imagine the trauma to the Kurds of prohibiting them from speaking their language. This is what happened to the Native Americans. They were prohibited to speak their native languages in the United States. Yes. Prohibited to speak their native languages on the reservations, right? Imagine that. And here, for the first time now, they're allowing them to teach their language, to teach. This is what they've done. So this so-called fascist Turkish government that's being presented to Western people is removing a lot of the darkness that had descended upon the people from before. But people are very worried. You know, there's people that are secular and they think, oh, these are the Muslims taking over. Well, they're Muslim people, but they're committed to a secular state, right? And the idea that Islam and secularity are mutually exclusive is false, because the vast majority of Islamic history had relatively secular states. They weren't really Islamic states. The whole concept of an Islamic state is a fantasy in the minds of a lot of the modern Islamists. But if you actually study Muslim history, that you will find, yes, Islam was the state religion, but the states functioned just like a secular state functions, because religion actually has very little to do with the running of a state. Building roads has nothing to do with what madhab you follow. You know, oh, that's a Hanafi road. No, that's a madhab. Right? The madhab means road in Arabic, but madhab is a school, is a metaphor taken from the real madhab, which is a road. No, a road is, you can build it from stone, you can build it from asphalt, you can build it from concrete, and that's just what you want is honesty, you want vetting, you want transparency. Those are secular ideals as well, right? A post office is not an Islamic concept, right? You don't need, we need Islamic stamps. Yeah, you can put the head of, like Muslims had La ilaha illallah on their coins. Okay. In America, they have kind of La ilaha illallah, tawakkalna ala Allah. That's right. I mean, that's okay. America's a secular state. It still has tawakkalna ala Allah, right? So that's okay. You can have, in God we trust. It's not, you can be secular and still trust in God. It's okay, right? Municipalities are not, you know, the water doesn't, I need a Hanafi, you know, they call it Hanafiya in Arabic. I need a Hanafiya. This is a Maliki Hanafiya. No, you don't need, you just need a Hanafiya. You just need a water, right, tap that works. And that's municipalities, and all you want is some honest guy in there. If he's a secularist who's honest, fine. If he's a Muslim who's honest, fine. As long as the water gets there, it's been purified, it's not going to make you sick, right? Seriously, think about it. The vast majority of government just does not relate to religion. It just relates to common decency. And that's why you can live in, I mean, if Muslims were literally taken from like 8th century Syria or Palestine and dropped into Norway, they would think that, you know, it was like the caliphate of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Like there's so much social justice. They would be amazed at how much social justice are in these Scandinavian countries. They're secular countries. So this whole idea, but no, you have to have had punishment. You know, this is what, so Islam is reduced to, there's 4 agreed upon had punishments, 13, there's debates about, you know, even apostasy laws, all these things, they're all debated. There's nothing fixed in stone. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Idra'u al-hudud mastata'tum." Avoid implementing penal punishments as much as you're able to. No, we'll cut, let's get these hands cut off. You know, I mean, if you implemented had punishment for theft, you couldn't shake hands anymore. You wouldn't be able to shake hands. Everybody'd be like, you know, nice to meet you, right? I mean, from the president all the way down to the street sweeper, man, we would. Am I making this up? So, you know, anyway, that's a very long answer to a very short question. So, would you recommend a book for beginners to read on logic? Well, that's what we're doing. It's a beginning book on logic. Merriam-Joseph's book is very good. And it helps, if English is your first language, it definitely helps to study logic in English before you do it in Arabic. My own personal experience, I read it in Arabic. It was very difficult for me initially. And after I studied it in English, I studied it several years ago using Aristotle's text with my father. And after that, when I went back to the Arabic, it was just very much easier to do. So, and there's good, but it's important to note that this is traditional logic. It's not symbolic logic, which is very different. Symbolic logic is a type of mathematical logic that it's useful for certain things, but for reasoning in terms of language, it's not useful at all because of certain problems that it has associated with it. All right, so alhamdulillah, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. I just want to also, for the people that are online, just welcome you for being part of this. And everybody, I really hope, inshallah, you have a wonderful experience, your time in Turkey. They've been incredibly hospitable. It's a beautiful people. They're good people. And they're all types of people. And the whole spectrum is here in Turkey, but they're still very decent people, whether they're secularists or committed to Islam. I think you'll, by and large, find a lot of just human decency. That's been my experience. I've been in Turkey now several times and spent, periods close to a month, a couple of those times, and that's been my experience with the people from the top all the way down to the simple people, and it's a great tradition. They have a great tradition here, and they're also, I think one of the things that I really like about Turkey is they still have an aesthetic sense that a lot of Muslim countries have lost. So they tend to really, beauty is still very much part of their culture, and they have beautiful parks. They have a lot of beautiful architecture still. Istanbul is arguably, I think, the most beautiful city aesthetically outside of Medina, because I'm not going to say anything is more beautiful than Medina. Now Medina is the mosque alone, and it's a very beautiful mosque. It's the most beautiful mosque in the world. And but after Medina, I would definitely say, I was in Istanbul, and I said to this Turkish man, he told me he'd studied in San Francisco. I said, "Oh, that's our Istanbul," and he's like, I said, the bay, it's got water and hills, and he just went, no, no. And so, jazakumullah khairan, marhaban. And also make dua for the organizers. They've worked really hard. Dr. Aisha and her team, really sincere group of people, worked very hard to make all this happen. So inshallah, may Allah make it a blessed time for you, a time of learning and opening. And my advice to you is, don't turn on the TV. Try to avoid, just unplug for a little while. You're all plugged in. It's good to unplug for a while and just try to focus on your studies as much as possible. We didn't plan having a mall next to us, so my advice, don't go into the mall. Dr. Yang is coming tonight, so we traditionally we always had an exercise component in the rihla, and then Joseph, Allah yarhamuhu, who used to do do you remember Joseph? Yeah, he in New Mexico and things. He used to do the Tai Chi and the Kung Fu. And he died, Allah yarhamuhu. So after that, we just didn't do it, but we'd always had that component because I think it's very important for people. Muslims tend to neglect their bodies a lot, and traditional societies, there was a lot of exercise, just being in a traditional society, walking and horseback riding and archery and wrestling. The Prophet ﷺ was a very active, all the way through his whole life. He was physically very active. He had no fat on him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was described as having a very flat stomach, even when he was 63 years of age. He was very muscular, he was sinewy and very strong. And Umar ibn al-Khattab once saw a man who was overweight in Mecca, and he said, that would be better if it was on somebody else. Right? So in other words, your extra caloric intake, might be better if you give that to somebody else. Now, don't judge anybody, because some people have, you never know about people. So if you see people that are overweight, just don't be judgmental about them or arrogant or anything, because some people, they don't eat a lot. And in fact, Imam al-Banani says that some of the awliya are tried with fat. Like Allah makes them fat even though they don't eat anything. And I've seen that with some people, don't make any judgments about people about that. And I don't want people to feel bad or anything like that. But it's good just to do exercise. You can be, women should, traditionally they were, had good weight. And so there's no blemish in a woman who's got weight on her. It's actually healthier for a woman to have fat, really. So these skinny women end up losing their periods. They can't have children, and this happens. Like they do too much exercise, and they actually end up losing their femininity and becoming there's a new hybrid species out there that's androgynous. So, but it's good, inshallah. I hope people enjoy it. He's a Qigong master, and Qigong is not a religious exercise. There is relation to the Taoist tradition and to Shaolin temples and things like that. So there is association, but it's the exercise that went with martial arts in China. And it's very, very invigorating for people that do it on a regular basis and practice it. But he's going to be working with you, so you can pretty much learn how to do it during the time. And it's good to learn it from somebody. There's a lot online and things like that. But according to the New York Times, the longest living human being ever was a Qigong teacher in China. They ascertained, he claimed to be 235 years of age. But they did ascertain that he was at least 170. And he taught Qigong to the imperial troops. And the New York Times sent a team over to find out about him in 1932, I think. So that was actually, and ate goji berries and drank green tea and ginseng. So, I mean, I don't know if anybody really wants to stick around here for 175 years, but the time we're here, we should try to be as healthy as possible, because it'll help you. Yeah. My mom was at the grocery store, and you know how they have all those funny National Enquirer and all those, and my mom's 94 this year, and there was another old lady in the line, and she looked at my mother, and then she looked at the magazines, and she said, "Aren't you glad we're on our way out?" Assalamu alaikum.